Script 12. A determined 10-year-old girl walked into a pawn shop carrying her sister's doll, and what she said broke heart. The brass bell above the door didn't just chime. It announced a trespass, a sharp metallic sound that seemed to freeze the dust motes dancing in the late afternoon light. For 10-year-old Iris, standing on the threshold of the pawn shop, that bell was the loudest thing in the world. She looked small against the backdrop of towering shelves and barred windows, a child framed by the heavy, stale atmosphere of an adult world. In her hands, she clutched a gray pillowcase, the fabric worn thin from years of washing, wrapped protectively around a shape that was clearly not meant for a place like this. She held it high against her chest, not like a burden, but like a fragile bird that might fly away if her grip loosened even for a second. Her eyes darted to the clock on the back wall. It read 5:45 p.m. The hands of the clock felt like a countdown. She had exactly 15 minutes before the sign on the door would be flipped to closed. 15 minutes to secure a future that felt terrifyingly uncertain. Taking a breath that didn't quite fill her lungs, she stepped away from the door and moved toward the high counter where judgment awaited. To understand the courage it took to cross that threshold, you have to understand the journey that brought her there. It was only a 6-block walk from her apartment building to the pawn shop, a distance that most adults would cover in 10 minutes without looking up from their phones. But for a 10-year-old girl walking alone, the city transforms into something vast and indifferent. Iris had retraced these blocks with a singular focus, moving through a landscape that usually felt strictly off-limits to a child without a hand to hold. The street was alive with the chaotic energy of the end-of-day rush. Delivery trucks idled with deep, rumbled growls, and taxis wove through traffic with sharp blasts of their horns. Commuters rushed past her, their eyes fixed on horizons she couldn't see, barely registering the small figure navigating the currents of the sidewalk. The noise was a physical wall, a cacophony of sirens and shouting that should have been frightening. Yet, the chaos outside was nothing compared to the quiet, focused panic blooming inside Iris's chest. The external world was loud, but her internal world was screaming in silence. She focused entirely on the object in her arms. Physically, the porcelain doll wrapped in the gray pillowcase weighed no more than a few pounds. It was light, delicate, a thing of hollow ceramics and stuffed cloth. But emotional weight doesn't follow the laws of physics. As she walked, the doll felt heavier with every step, as if she were carrying the weight of a betrayal. She held it so tight her knuckles turned white, terrified that a stumble or a bump from a careless stranger would shatter the only leverage she had left. There is a specific kind of isolation that comes when you are young and carrying a secret that is too big for your shoulders. You look at the world differently. The buildings seem taller, leaning in to obscure the sky. The faces of passing adults seem harder, closed off behind masks of exhaustion or indifference. You realize, with a sudden and chilling clarity, that the safety net you thought existed, the idea that adults will always step in to fix things, is gone. You are the one who has to fix it. The world isn't malicious, it's just vast, and in its vastness, it doesn't notice a little girl trying to save her family. Iris caught her reflection in a shop window as she passed. She didn't look like a hero. She looked like a child trying desperately to maintain order in a life that was unraveling. Her denim jacket was clean but frayed at the cuffs, a hand-me-down that had seen better days. Her sneakers were scuffed, the rubber wearing thin at the toes, but the laces were tied in fierce, tight double knots. It was a small detail, but it spoke volumes. Those knots were a testament to her need for security, a physical manifestation of her attempt to keep things from coming undone. She wasn't just walking, she was marching with a purpose that aged her. As she turned the final corner toward the shop with the 3 gold balls hanging above the entrance, the noise of the street faded into a dull hum. Her mind drifted away from the pavement and the traffic, pulled back to the moment an hour ago that had pushed her out the door, the memory of a silent bedroom that changed everything. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. Usually, the rhythm of their home was defined by the small, wheezing coughs that came from the bottom bunk, a sound that had become the background noise of Iris's life for the past week. But an hour ago, that rhythm had broken. The silence that filled the bedroom wasn't the peaceful quiet of deep sleep. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of exhaustion, the kind that happens when a body is too tired to fight for air. Iris had been sitting at the small laminate desk, attempting to focus on her math homework, when the change in the room's atmosphere made the hair on her arms stand up. She turned slowly to look at the bottom bunk. Ellie was asleep, but her skin was pale, damp with a cold sweat, and her chest was barely rising. Iris moved instantly. She didn't call out. She knew better than to wake a sick child who had finally settled. Instead, she reached for the nightstand. Her hand closed around the amber plastic of the medicine bottle. It felt wrong immediately, too light. She gave it a gentle shake. There was no liquid slosh, no reassuring weight of relief inside. She held it up to the sliver of light coming through the blinds. Empty. A residue of pink syrup clung to the bottom, a mockery of what they needed. She checked the label, her finger tracing the small print with a trembling precision. Refill 0. The date was today. The dosage time was now. Panic is a cold thing. It starts in the stomach and moves to the hands. Iris felt it, but she didn't let it take over. She couldn't. Her mother was 5 miles away, deep into the second half of a double shift at the diner. Calling her wasn't an option. If her mother left her shift early, the manager would cut her hours for the rest of the week, and the rent was already 3 days late. This was the brutal mathematics of their survival. The cost of a phone call was higher than the cost of the medicine itself. Iris was on her own. She was 10 years old, but in that moment, she was the head of the household, the protector, and the problem solver. She moved to the kitchen, her socks sliding on the worn linoleum. On top of the fridge sat the emergency jar, an old coffee tin that held the family's fragile safety net. She pulled it down and dumped the contents onto the counter. The sound was a pathetic clatter of copper and nickel. She counted it twice, her lips moving silently as she stacked the coins. $1.47. She needed 20. She stared at the coins, willing them to multiply, but the math remained stubborn and cruel. The jar had been emptied 2 days ago to keep the electricity on. There was nothing left. She walked back into the bedroom. The sound of Ellie's shallow breathing seemed to fill the corners of the room, growing louder in her mind with every second. Iris scanned the space with the eyes of an appraiser. What did they have? What could the world possibly want from 2 little girls? She looked at her own shelf. A plastic horse with a missing leg. A stack of library books she had forgotten to return. A glittery notebook with 3 pages left. Worthless. Her possessions were treasures only to her. To a pawn shop, they were trash. She felt a surge of helplessness, a hot sting behind her eyes, but she blinked it away. Crying wouldn't fill the bottle. Then, her gaze drifted to the top of the dresser. There, sitting on a doily that their grandmother had crocheted, was Clara. The doll didn't belong in this apartment. She was an antique, a porcelain beauty with hand-painted blue eyes and a dress made of real velvet. She had been a gift from their grandmother before she passed, intended for Ellie, who was the baby of the family. Clara wasn't played with, she was admired. She was the one beautiful, perfect thing they owned, a promise that they came from somewhere nice, that they deserved nice things. Iris looked at the doll, then at her sister's pale face. The choice was terrible, and it was simple. The doll was perfect, her sister was fading. In the economy of love, the decision had already been made. To understand why this choice caused Iris's hands to tremble as she reached out, you have to understand that Clara wasn't just a doll. She wasn't a mass-produced toy picked from a shelf in a brightly lit aisle. Clara was a resurrection. Their grandmother had found the doll years ago at a flea market, shattered and abandoned, her porcelain face cracked and her dress in tatters. For months, the girls had watched their grandmother work at the kitchen table, mixing paints to match the delicate blush of a cheek, sewing tiny stitches into velvet to recreate a Victorian gown. When she gave Clara to Ellie, she hadn't just given a gift, she had given a lesson. She had taught them that broken things could be made whole again, that value wasn't about being new, but about being loved. Clara was the physical embodiment of their grandmother's patience, the last tangible piece of a woman who had made them feel safe. To sell her felt like selling a memory. Iris stood before the dresser, her fingers hovering over the doll's painted curls. A wave of nausea rolled through her stomach. Taking Clara felt like a betrayal of the highest order. It felt like theft. Ellie trusted her. Ellie looked at Iris not just as a sister, but as a second mother, a protector who kept the nightmares away. Stealing her most prized possession while she lay defenseless in a feverish sleep was a violation of that unspoken pact. It was the kind of act that leaves a mark on your conscience, a small, dark stain that doesn't wash out. Iris imagined Ellie waking up, her small hands reaching out for the cool porcelain comfort of her friend, only to grasp at empty air. The thought made Iris's chest ache with a physical sharpness. But then the sound of wheezing cut through the room again, a harsh, rattling reminder of the reality they were living in. Sentimentality was a luxury. Oxygen was a necessity. Iris swallowed the lump in her throat and picked Clara up. The doll was cool to the touch, her glass eyes staring back with an unnerving, placid calm. Iris moved to the bunk bed. Ellie was shifting restlessly beneath the thin quilt, her brow furrowed in discomfort. Even in sleep, her body was seeking comfort, her arms curling inward, looking for something to hold. Iris knew she couldn't leave Ellie's arms empty. If her sister woke up alone in the void of the bed, the panic would make her breathing worse. Iris pulled off her own gray cardigan, the soft, knitted one that smelled of their laundry detergent in safety. She rolled it into a tight, dense bundle, shaping it until it was roughly the size of the doll. With the stealth of a thief, she gently lifted Ellie's arm. The little girl murmured, a sound of protest that died in her throat. Iris held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She slid the rolled-up sweater into the space against Ellie's chest and lowered her sister's arm around it. Ellie sighed, her fingers kneading the soft wool, and settled back into the pillow. She accepted the lie. The substitution worked. This is the terrible, quiet burden of the eldest sibling. You are forced to make executive decisions that no child should ever have to make. You become a strategist of survival, weighing the cost of a sister's happiness against the cost of her health. You learn that sometimes protecting someone means hurting them in the short term. Iris looked down at the bundle of wool in her sister's arms and the porcelain treasure in her own. She hardened her heart, forcing the guilt into a small, locked box in the back of her mind. A sad sister could be comforted later. A sad sister could be apologized to. But a sick sister, a sister whose lungs were closing up, that was a cliff edge Iris refused to walk near. She wrapped Clara in the pillowcase she had pulled from the linen closet, shrouding the beautiful velvet dress in gray cotton. She didn't look back at the bed. She couldn't afford to hesitate. She walked to the apartment door, the floorboards creaking softly under her weight. Opening the door, she stepped out into the hallway and turned the lock with a definitive click. That sound was the seal on her decision. She was no longer just a sister playing house. She was a provider stepping out into the cold, bringing her offering to the altar of the pawn shop. The doll was gone. The mission had begun. The air inside the shop was a physical barrier, distinct and heavy, separating the interior from the bustling street outside. It smelled of stale coffee that had been sitting on a burner for too long, mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of old silver and the dusty, musty scent of things that had been owned and lost. It was the smell of other people's bad luck. To walk into a pawn shop is to walk into a museum of temporary failures. Every guitar hanging on the wall, every wedding ring sitting under the scratched glass of the counter, every power drill and television set represented a moment where someone had run out of options. The silence here was different than the silence in the bedroom. It wasn't the silence of sickness, but the silence of waiting. Thousands of objects sat in a state of purgatory, waiting to be reclaimed by owners who likely never would, or to be bought by strangers who didn't know their history. Behind the high counter, which was raised like a judge's bench to separate the petitioner from the authority, sat Mr. Henderson. He was a man who seemed to have been carved out of the same worn wood as the shop's fixtures. His face was a map of deep lines and cynical creases, the face of a man who had heard every sob story, every desperate plea, and every fabricated excuse the city had to offer. He didn't look up when the bell chimed. He didn't look up when the door clicked shut. He remained hunched over a ledger, his thick fingers moving a pen across the paper with a rhythmic, scratching sound. In his world, a customer wasn't real until they placed something of value on the glass. Until then, they were just a ghost haunting his doorway. Iris approached the counter. It was built for adults, the surface resting comfortably at chest height for a grown man, but towering over a 10-year-old. A different child might have stood on tiptoes, straining to be seen, hopping slightly to catch the broker's eye. A different child might have coughed or tapped on the glass or called out, "Hello?" in a small, wavering voice. Iris did none of these things. She understood, with an instinct honed by necessity, that acting small would only make her invisible. If she acted like a child, she would be dismissed like a child. So she stood with her feet planted firmly on the scuffed linoleum, her chin tilted up, her eyes fixed on the top of Mr. Henderson's balding head. She waited. She let her silence become a presence in the room, a pressure that built up until it was impossible to ignore. Mr. Henderson stopped writing. The pen hovered over the paper. The silence from the other side of the counter was too absolute, too heavy to be accidental. He sighed, a long, weary sound that rattled in his chest, and slowly lifted his head. His glasses had slipped down his nose, and he peered over the rims with eyes that were clouded by years of skepticism. He saw the girl standing there, clutching a gray pillowcase, and his expression didn't soften, it hardened. He had seen kids in here before, usually dragging in a parent's stolen watch or a video game console they had found, looking for quick cash for candy or trouble.
"We don't buy comic books, and I'm not running a daycare," he grunted, his voice rough like gravel tumbling in a dryer. "Go home to your parents, kid."
Iris didn't move. She didn't flinch at the harshness of his tone. She simply reached forward and placed the gray bundle on the scratched glass surface. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. She wasn't dumping a toy, she was presenting an offering. With fingers that trembled only slightly, she began to peel back the fabric of the pillowcase. She moved with the reverence of a museum curator unveiling a rare artifact. The gray cotton fell away, revealing the deep, rich velvet of the dress, the delicate lace of the collar, and finally, the serene, painted face of Clara. The doll lay on the counter, a stark anomaly amidst the dust and the grime. Her blue glass eyes caught the fluorescent light, shining with a clarity that seemed to challenge the dingy surroundings. For a moment, the shop felt different. The beauty of the object demanded attention. Mr. Henderson blinked. He hadn't expected this. He had expected plastic, batteries, cheap noise. Instead, he was looking at craftsmanship. He put his pen down and leaned forward, his interest piqued not by empathy, but by the sudden appearance of potential profit. He reached out, his large, calloused hands contrasting sharply with the doll's fragile porcelain skin. He didn't handle her with the love Iris did. He handled her with professional efficiency. He turned Clara over, checking the stitching on the dress, tapping the ceramic limbs to listen for hollows. He pulled a jeweler's loop from his pocket and brought it to his eye, leaning in close to inspect the doll's face. Iris held her breath, watching his rough fingers trace the features she had kissed goodnight 1,000 times. It felt like a medical exam, cold and invasive. "Late 19th century reproduction, maybe early 20th, Henderson muttered, more to himself than to her. He was categorizing, calculating, stripping the doll of her name and turning her into a set of data points. Then he stopped. His finger paused on the left cheek, right along the jawline. He made a noise, a sharp intake of breath through his teeth, the sound a mechanic makes when he finds a leak in the engine. "Here," he said, tapping the spot with a dirty fingernail. "Fracture, right along the jaw. It's been repaired, painted over, but the structure is compromised." He set the doll back down, not gently, but with the dismissal of a man who has found a fatal flaw. He looked at Iris, his eyes flat and transactional. "It's damaged goods, kid. The crack kills the collector value. It's just a broken toy in a fancy dress now." He was doing what he did best, devaluing the asset to lower the price. It was a negotiation tactic, a standard opening move in the chess game of pawnbroking. But as he looked at the girl, expecting her to crumble or argue or plead, he realized something was wrong. Iris wasn't looking at the doll with shame. She was looking at him with a terrifying intensity. The transaction had started as a business deal, but in the quiet space between his dismissal and her gaze, it was rapidly shifting into a battle of wills. $10, Henderson said. He didn't phrase it as an offer. He said it with the flat, final tone of a man who dictates reality, not one who negotiates it. He reached toward the cash drawer beneath the counter, the heavy metallic clack of the register unlocking echoing through the quiet shop like a gavel striking a sounding block. To him, this was generous. He was paying for the velvet, not the porcelain. He was paying for the parts, not the whole. For Iris, the number 10 hung in the air, physical and suffocating. $10 was a mathematical impossibility. $10 bought half a bottle of the generic syrup. Half a bottle bought 12 hours of breathing. 12 hours wasn't enough to get her mother to payday. 12 hours wasn't a solution. It was just a pause button on a panic that would restart before the sun came up. The distance between the $10 on the table and the $20 she needed was a chasm wide enough to swallow her whole family. She didn't reach for the money. She didn't look at his hands. She looked directly into his eyes, her gaze steady and unnerving for a child of her age. "I need 20, she said. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't rise in a whine or dip into a plea. It was the voice of someone stating a law of physics. Gravity pulls down, fire burns, the medicine costs $20. There was no room in her world for variables. Henderson paused, his hand hovering over the drawer. He let out a short, dry laugh that had no humor in it. He leaned back in his creaking leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "You need 20? Well, I need a vacation. We don't always get what we want, kid. That doll is cracked. The market for broken antiques isn't exactly booming. 10 is the price. Take it or leave it." The air in the shop grew tighter. A normal child would have folded here. A normal child would have taken the $10, bought candy or a comic book, and run home. Or they would have cried, tears spilling over dirty cheeks until the adult gave in out of annoyance. But Iris didn't cry. She understood something Mr. Henderson didn't. This wasn't a transaction about value. It was a transaction about survival. You don't haggle when the house is on fire. You just find the water.
"It is worth 20, Iris insisted, her small hands gripping the edge of the high counter until her knuckles turned white. "The dress is real velvet. My grandmother sewed it. The lace is from her wedding dress. It's not just a doll."
Henderson waved a hand dismissively, his patience fraying like the cuffs of an old shirt. "I'm not running a charity, and I'm not a therapist. If you want $20, go ask your parents. Go mow a lawn. But don't stand here and tell me how to run my business. Now take the 10 or take the doll and get out. I've got inventory to check." He reached for the doll, intending to shove it back toward her, to end this uncomfortable interaction. But Iris didn't move. She didn't flinch. She stood her ground with the ferocious immobility of a guard dog protecting a gate. She looked at the clock. 5:52 p.m. She had 8 minutes. She couldn't leave. Leaving meant going home empty-handed. Leaving meant listening to the wheezing get worse. Leaving meant failing Ellie. Henderson stopped. His hand retreated from the doll. He frowned, really looking at her for the first time. He saw the worn cuffs of her jacket. He saw the double-knotted laces. He saw the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of nights spent awake listening to someone else cough. The cynicism that usually protected him cracked, just a fraction. He was confused. Kids sold toys for upgrades, video games, skateboards, headphones. They didn't sell them with this kind of desperate, quiet intensity. "Why?" he asked, the words slipping out before he could stop it. His voice dropped, losing its harsh professional edge. "Why are you fighting so hard for this? It's just a doll. You'll regret selling it tomorrow. You'll come back crying, wanting it back, and I'll have to charge you double. Why are you doing this?" The question hung between them, suspended in the dust motes. Iris looked down at Clara, lying prone on the scratched glass, her painted smile serene and indifferent to the stakes. Then she looked back up at Mr. Henderson. The mask of the stubborn negotiator fell away, revealing the terrified 10-year-old girl beneath. "It's not my toy," she said, her voice soft but cutting through the silence like a razor. "It's my sister's best friend, but her best friend can't help her breathe." The words landed with a physical weight. The shop went completely silent. The ticking clock seemed to stop. The hum of the refrigerator in the back room faded away. Mr. Henderson sat frozen, his hands still halfway to the register. The statement stripped away every defense he had. It wasn't a sales pitch. It wasn't a sob story designed to manipulate. It was the brutal, unvarnished truth of a child forced to trade comfort for life. He looked at the girl, really saw her, and for the first time in years, the pawnbroker didn't see a customer. He saw a sister. And the silence that followed was louder than any bell. Mr. Henderson let out a breath that seemed to deflate his entire posture. The cynical armor he wore, like a second skin, dissolved in the face of that simple, devastating sentence. He looked at the girl, really looked at her, and saw the trembling in her hands that she was trying so hard to hide. He saw the way she stood, feet planted apart, bracing herself against a world that was trying to knock her over. The silence in the shop stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable, until Henderson broke it with the scrape of his chair against the floor. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. It was thick with receipts and business cards, but he bypassed those, digging his fingers into the billfold. He pulled out a $20 bill. It was crisp, the kind of money that feels substantial in your hand. He didn't open the register. This was his own money. He slid the bill across the glass counter, pushing it toward Iris, and then he pushed the doll back toward her as well. "Take it," he said, his voice gruff, trying to mask the kindness with irritation. "Take the money, keep the doll, go get the medicine. I don't need a broken antique taking up shelf space." It was a gesture of mercy. It was the kind of thing adults do when they want to fix a problem quickly, when they want to stop the uncomfortable feeling of witnessing a child's pain. It was charity. And a minute ago, Iris would have given anything for that $20. But as she looked at the bill sitting on the glass, and then at the man's pitying eyes, something inside her stiffened. She didn't reach for the money. Instead, she extended a single finger and slid the bill back across the counter, halfway toward him. "I can't take that," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it had a steel core that surprised even her. Henderson blinked, confused. "It's what you need, isn't it? Take it and go." "If I take it for free,
Iris said, looking down at her sneakers. Then I'm begging. My mom, she says we don't beg. If I come home with money I didn't earn, I can't look her in the eye. I can't tell her I fixed it. I just took it. She looked up then, pointing a finger toward the front window. Taped to the glass, fading in the sun, was a handwritten sign on a piece of cardboard. Sweeper wanted. Inquire within. I saw the sign, Iris said. I'll trade you. The doll plus 20 minutes of sweeping. The floor is dirty. I can see the dust bunnies under the shelves. I'll clean the whole front room. That makes up the other $10. That makes it fair. Mr. Henderson stared at her. He looked at the sign he had put up 3 months ago and forgotten about. He looked at the floor, which was indeed covered in a fine layer of city grit. And then he looked back at the 10-year-old girl who was refusing a lifeline because she preferred to build a bridge. He realized then that he wasn't negotiating with a child. He was negotiating with someone who understood the currency of dignity. If he gave her the money, he saved her sister, but he broke her pride. If he let her work, he saved them both. The broom is in the corner, Henderson said, his voice shifting. The pity was gone, replaced by a professional respect. You miss a spot, I dock your pay. Iris didn't smile, but her shoulders dropped an inch. She walked to the corner and grabbed the industrial push broom. It was heavy, the handle thick and polished smooth by years of use, growing taller than she was. She maneuvered it with a fierce, concentrated energy. For the next 20 minutes, the only sound in the shop was the rhythmic swish, swish of stiff bristles against linoleum. She swept with a vengeance. She wasn't just moving dust, she was sweeping away the helplessness she had felt in the bedroom. She swept under the racks of old coats, behind the glass display cases, and into the corners where the shadows gathered. Clouds of dust rose up and danced in the shafts of sunlight, but she didn't stop. Her forehead beaded with sweat, her arms ached, but with every pile of dirt she collected, the panic in her chest receded a little further. She was doing something. She was working. She was solving the problem with her own 2 hands. Behind the counter, Mr. Henderson watched her. He had stopped working on his ledger. He picked up Clara, the doll, and looked at her again. He saw the crack in the jaw, yes, but he also saw the care in the stitching. He pulled out a small tag and wrote a number on it. Then, he wrote something else on the back of the ticket, something he didn't usually write for walk-ins. When Iris finished, a neat pile of gray dust sat in the center of the room. She put the broom away and returned to the counter, breathless but standing tall. She had held up her end of the bargain. Henderson nodded, a single sharp dip of his chin. Passable, he grunted. He opened the register, the official one this time, and took out a $10 bill. He placed it on top of the $10 he had originally offered for the doll. $20, earned, verified, and valid. Here, he said, sliding the money over along with a yellow pawn ticket. And listen to me. This isn't a sale, it's a loan. You have 30 days. You come back with $20, you get the doll back. I'm not putting her on the shelf. She stays in the back office, safe. Iris took the money. It felt warm in her hand. It felt heavy, not with burden, but with value. She looked at the ticket, then at the empty space on the counter where Clara had been. She didn't say thank you for the favor. She said thank you for the business. I'll be back, she said. And for the first time since she entered the shop, the bell above the door didn't sound like an alarm. As she turned to leave, the chime sounded like a victory. The transaction at the pharmacy was clinical, a stark contrast to the dusty warmth of the pawn shop. The fluorescent lights hummed with an aggressive brightness as Iris slid the crumpled $20 bills across the high white counter. There was no negotiation here, no judgment, just the beep of a scanner and the exchange of paper for relief. The pharmacist didn't look at her twice. He didn't see the dust on her jeans or the exhaustion in her posture. He just handed over the white paper bag with a receipt stapled to the side. Stepping back out onto the street, the city had shifted. The sun had finally dipped below the skyline, painting the concrete in shades of bruised purple and charcoal. Iris moved with a new cadence. The heavy, fragile burden of the porcelain doll was gone, replaced by the rhythmic, plastic rattle of the medicine bottle in her pocket. Shk, shk, shk. It was the sound of a problem solved. She passed the playground where other kids were being called home for dinner, their lives defined by meals and bedtimes, not negotiations and debts. She felt lighter, physically unburdened, yet a phantom weight lingered in her arms where Clara used to be. She walked faster, the cold evening air stinging her cheeks, but she barely felt it. The only thing that mattered was the chemistry in her pocket. Back in the apartment, the air was still thick with the heat of the day. Iris didn't stop to take off her jacket. She moved straight to the kitchen, pouring the pink liquid into the dosing cup with hands that were finally steady. In the bedroom, the sound of wheezing was a jagged tear in the quiet. Ellie was tangled in the sheets, her face flushed. Iris sat on the edge of the bed, her presence immediate and calming. She lifted Ellie's head, guiding the cup to her lips.
"Drink, Elle," she whispered. "It's the magic stuff." Ellie swallowed, grimaced, and sank back down. Iris sat vigil. She watched the digital clock, counting the minutes. 10. 15. Slowly, the harsh, scraping sound of her sister's breathing began to smooth out. The tension in Ellie's small brow relaxed. The medicine was winning. But as the fever broke, clarity returned. Ellie shifted, her hands searching the mattress instinctively. Her fingers brushed the rolled-up sweater Iris had left as a decoy. She froze. Her eyes fluttered open, confused and vulnerable. "Iris?" Her voice was a croak. "Where's Clara?" "This isn't Clara." Iris felt a sharp pang in her chest, sharper than the fear of the pawn shop. This was the cost. She smoothed the hair back from Ellie's forehead, keeping her face open and honest. "Clara had to go to the hospital too," Iris lied, the words tasting like ash. "Remember her cracked jaw? I took her to the special doctor. She has to stay there for a checkup." Ellie looked at her, eyes wide. "Is she coming back?" "I promise," Iris said, and this time it wasn't a lie. "I'm going to bring her home." Ellie nodded, the medication pulling her back toward sleep. "Okay, tell her to be brave." When Ellie's breathing deepened into a true, restful sleep, Iris pulled the yellow pawn ticket from her pocket. She smoothed the paper out, reading the date. 30 days. It was a deadline, but it was also a lifeline. She didn't leave it on the dresser. She slid a shoebox out from under her bed, her archive of secrets, and placed the ticket inside. It wasn't a record of what she had lost. It was a map of what she had to do next. She would sweep that shop floor until the wood wore down if she had to. The room was finally peaceful. The only sound was the steady rise and fall of Ellie's chest, a rhythm that sounded like victory. Iris sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on, a 10-year-old girl who had learned that sometimes love looks less like a hug and more like a sacrifice no one else will ever see. If this story reminded you of the quiet strength in a young heart, please like and subscribe to Echo Tales for more.